On the 1st of February 1959, someone in the group took a photograph. It shows a wall of snow, a few dark figures, and the faint outline of a tent being pitched against howling wind. The camera was later found frozen solid in the abandoned camp. The person who took the photo was already dead. 9 people walked into the northern Ural Mountains that winter. Not one of them walked out. And 67 years later, we still cannot fully explain why. The expedition was led by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute. He was an experienced hiker. This trip was meant to earn him a Grade 3 certification, the highest level in Soviet sport tourism. His group consisted of 8 others: Zinaida Kolmogorova, Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolevatov, Rustem Slobodin, Yuri Krivonishenko, Yuri Doroshenko, Nikolai Chibo-Brignol, and Alexander Zolotaryov. Most were students in their early 20s. Zolotaryov, at 37, was the oldest and the most enigmatic. He had joined the group late, and some researchers have since noted his background included possible military intelligence connections, though this remains unverified. They departed on January 27th from the city of Sverdlovsk, now Yekaterinburg, heading for Otorten, a peak whose name in the indigenous Mansi language is sometimes translated as "don't go there." One member, Yuri Yudin, turned back on January 28th due to illness. That decision saved his life. From their recovered diaries and photographs, we can reconstruct the journey in detail. The weather worsened steadily. On January 31st, the group stashed surplus food and equipment at a base camp in a forested valley. Then they began the climb toward Otorten. On February 1st, they deviated slightly west and ended up on the slope of Kholat Syakhl, a Mansi name that translates to Dead Mountain. Rather than descend back to the tree line for shelter, Dyatlov decided to pitch the tent on the exposed slope. He likely wanted to maintain altitude so they wouldn't lose progress. It was the last decision he ever made. The group set up their tent around 5 p.m. They ate dinner. Some wrote in their diaries. A humorous newsletter they'd been composing, the Otorten Evening News, was found later, its tone lighthearted. Then something happened. When search parties reached the camp on February 26th, the tent was partially collapsed and covered in snow. The most disturbing detail: it had been cut open from the inside. Not unzipped, not pulled apart, slashed with a knife from within. The hikers had fled into temperatures between -25 and -30 degrees Celsius. Most were in their socks or barefoot. Some wore only underwear. They left behind their boots, their coats, their survival gear, everything that could have kept them alive. Whatever drove them out of that tent was more terrifying than a Siberian winter night. Footprints, 8 or 9 sets, led away from the tent in an orderly group, heading downhill toward the tree line, roughly 1.5 kilometers away. The prints suggested the hikers were walking, not running in blind panic. This detail has puzzled investigators for decades. The first 2 bodies were found on February 27th under a large cedar tree at the edge of the forest. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko were in their underwear. The remains of a small fire smoldered nearby. Branches on the cedar were broken up to 5 meters high. They had climbed the tree, desperately, possibly looking back toward the tent or trying to signal. 300 meters uphill from the cedar, searchers found Igor Dyatlov. He was on his back, gripping a small branch. Zinaida Kolmogorova lay 150 meters further up, face down in the snow. Rustem Slobodin was found between them. He had a fracture in his skull, but the medical examiner said it wasn't sufficient to cause unconsciousness. All 3 appeared to have been trying to return to the tent. The remaining 4 were not found until May, after the snow melted. They were in a ravine 75 meters from the cedar, buried under 4 meters of snow. Their injuries were catastrophic. Chibo-Brignol had massive skull fractures. Dubinina and Zolotaryov had crushed chests, ribs broken with a force the examiner compared to a car crash. And Dubinina was missing her tongue, her eyes, and part of her lips. There was no external soft tissue damage to explain the internal injuries. No signs of a struggle. No evidence of an attack. The official Soviet investigation, led by prosecutor Lev Ivanov, was swift and strange. Early reports noted that some of the hikers' clothing tested positive for radioactive contamination. Ivanov reportedly became interested in reports from other hikers and local Mansi people who described seeing strange orange spheres in the sky during February and March 1959, but the case was closed on May 28, 1959. The official conclusion: the group died from a compelling natural force. No further explanation was offered. The case files were classified. Ivanov was reportedly told to close the investigation by Soviet authorities. In a 1990 interview, years after the Soviet Union's collapse, Ivanov stated he believed the deaths were connected to UFO activity, though whether he meant this literally or as a euphemism for military testing remains debated. The classification fueled decades of speculation. If the answer was simply an avalanche or hypothermia, why would the Soviet government seal the records? In 2019, the Russian government reopened the investigation. In 2020, they concluded the cause was a slab avalanche, a delayed snowslide triggered by the hikers cutting into the slope to pitch their tent. The theory proposes the avalanche hit at night, injuring some members, and the group evacuated in panic. In 2021, researchers at EPFL in Switzerland published a mechanical study in the journal Communications, Earth and Environment. Using avalanche simulation models, they demonstrated that a small, delayed slab avalanche was physically plausible at the site and could produce the exact chest and skull injuries found on the victims. Injuries consistent with a rigid snow block pressing against a body lying on a hard surface, like a ski or pack. This would explain why there was no large avalanche debris field. The slab was small enough to collapse part of the tent, but not bury the site entirely. But skeptics remain. Some note the slope angle at the tent site, roughly 15 to 18 degrees, is unusually gentle for a slab avalanche. Others point out the orderly footprints, which don't match the chaos of an avalanche evacuation. And the radioactive contamination, while potentially explained by thorium mantles from camping lanterns or Krivonishenko's work at a nuclear facility, has never been conclusively sourced. Here's what we know for certain. 9 people cut open their own tent from the inside. They walked into lethal cold wearing almost nothing. Some suffered injuries equivalent to being hit by a vehicle. One lost her tongue. The Soviet government classified the case for 30 years, and the official explanation, then and now, leaves gaps. The avalanche theory is the most scientifically supported, but science deals in probabilities, not certainties. And on the slope of Dead Mountain, on a night in February 1959, something happened that was terrifying enough to make 9 rational, experienced hikers choose the cold over their shelter. We may never know what it was, but if you look at that last photograph, the snow, the wind, the silhouettes against the white, you can almost feel it. Something is wrong, and they already know. What do you think happened on Dead Mountain? Tell us in the comments. We are on the line 157-337. We will repeat this message. We will repeat this on 6210 kilocycles. Wait. Those were among the last confirmed words received from Amelia Earhart, transmitted on the morning of July 2, 1937. She was somewhere over the central Pacific Ocean, nearly out of fuel, searching for a tiny island she couldn't find. The crew of the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca heard her voice, strained, urgent, but couldn't get a fix on her position. Then the radio went silent, and one of the most famous people in the world vanished. By 1937, Amelia Earhart was the most famous woman in America, and arguably the most famous aviator alive. She had been the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean in 1932. She had set altitude records, speed records, and distance records. She was a best-selling author, a fashion designer, a visiting faculty member at Purdue University, and a public advocate for women in aviation. She co-founded the 99s, an organization of female pilots that still exists today. But Earhart wasn't just a celebrity. She was a genuinely skilled and courageous pilot who repeatedly pushed into uncharted territory. Her public persona, calm, confident, understated, masked the very real risks she took every time she climbed into a cockpit. In 1936, Purdue University helped fund a new aircraft for her, a Lockheed Electra 10E, a twin-engine, all-metal monoplane. It was configured as a flying laboratory, though in practice it was configured for one purpose: circumnavigating the globe along the equator, the longest possible route. The first attempt, in March 1937, ended in a ground loop during takeoff from Luke Field in Hawaii, damaging the Electra. After repairs, Earhart reversed the direction of her route, now flying east instead of west, and departed from Oakland, California on May 20, 1937, with Fred Noonan as her navigator. Noonan was one of the most experienced aerial navigators in the world. He had spent years charting routes across the Pacific for Pan American Airways and was considered a master of celestial navigation. He was also, by multiple accounts, struggling with alcoholism, a detail that would later fuel speculation about the flight's failure. Over the next 6 weeks, they flew roughly 22,000 miles across South America, Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. It was grueling. Earhart was exhausted. Noonan, by some accounts, was not always at his sharpest. On June 29th, they arrived in Lae, New Guinea. The next stop was Howland Island, 2,556 miles away across open ocean. A flat coral island barely 1 mile long and half a mile wide, rising only 6 feet above sea level. Finding it required navigational precision down to a fraction of a degree. They departed Lae at 10 a.m. local time on July 2nd. The Electra was loaded with approximately 1,100 gallons of fuel, enough for roughly 20 to 21 hours of flight. The trip to Howland was expected to take about 18 hours. The plan relied on the Itasca, stationed off Howland, to provide radio bearings. But there were problems from the start. Earhart and the Itasca were using different assumptions about radio frequencies and schedules. A high-frequency direction finder that had been set up on Howland may not have been operational, and Earhart had left behind a trailing wire antenna in Miami, reportedly to save weight, which limited her long-range radio capabilities. Throughout the night, the Itasca received sporadic, often garbled transmissions from Earhart. She reported overcast skies, a serious problem for Noonan, who needed to see stars for celestial navigation. At 7:42 a.m. Howland time, Earhart's voice came through clearly. "We must be on you but cannot see you. Fuel is running low. Been unable to reach you by radio." At 7:58 a.m., "We are circling but cannot see island, cannot hear you." At 8:43 a.m., the final transmission, "We are on the line 57337. A reference to a celestial line of position running northwest to southeast through Howland Island. She believed she was somewhere on that line, but didn't know which direction to turn. Then, nothing. The U.S. Navy and Coast Guard launched the most extensive air and sea search in history up to that point. The battleship USS Colorado, the aircraft carrier USS Lexington, and dozens of other vessels and aircraft scoured 250,000 square miles of the Pacific over 16 days. They found nothing, no wreckage, no oil slick, no debris, no bodies. The official conclusion: Earhart and Noonan ran out of fuel and crashed into the Pacific Ocean near Howland Island. Case closed, at least officially. But the absence of any physical evidence opened the door to nearly a century of competing theories, some grounded in evidence and some in fantasy. The most compelling alternative theory centers on Nikumaroro, formerly called Gardner Island, an uninhabited atoll roughly 350 miles southeast of Howland, directly along the 157-337 line of position. The International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, known as TIGHAR, has spent decades investigating this theory. Their hypothesis: Earhart and Noonan, unable to find Howland, turned southeast along the line of position and landed on Nikumaroro's flat reef during low tide. They survived as castaways for days or weeks before eventually perishing. The evidence is circumstantial but intriguing. In 1940, British colonial officer Gerald Gallagher found a partial human skeleton on Nikumaroro, along with a woman's shoe, a sextant box, and a bottle of Benedictine herbal liqueur. A British doctor measured the bones and concluded they belonged to a short, stocky European male. The bones were subsequently lost. In 2018, forensic anthropologist Richard Jantz reanalyzed the original measurements using modern techniques and concluded the bones were more consistent with a woman of Earhart's height and build than with a male. His analysis was published in the journal Forensic Anthropology and reignited interest in the Gardner Island theory. TIGHAR expeditions have also found fragments of plexiglass, aluminum, and a zipper consistent with 1930s American manufacture on the island. None has been conclusively linked to the Electra. A more controversial theory claims Earhart and Noonan were captured by the Japanese. This theory holds that they went down in the Marshall Islands, then a Japanese-controlled territory, and were taken to Saipan, where they were held as prisoners and eventually died. Supporters cite eyewitness testimonies from Marshall Islanders who reported seeing a silver plane crash land and 2 American aviators being taken away by Japanese soldiers. A photograph discovered in the U.S. National Archives in 2017 appeared to show Earhart and Noonan on a dock in Jaluit Atoll, but it was later traced to a 1935 Japanese travel book, published 2 years before the disappearance. No documentary evidence from Japanese military archives supports the capture theory. Japan's wartime records were extensively, though not completely, preserved after the war. The theory persists largely because the absence of wreckage makes it unfalsifiable. In 2024 and 2025, deep-sea exploration company Deep Sea Vision conducted sonar surveys of the ocean floor near Howland Island. They identified an object resembling an aircraft at a depth of roughly 16,000 feet. As of early 2026, no visual confirmation has been achieved. If the object is the Electra, it would support the simplest explanation. They ran out of fuel and went into the water. Here is what we can say with reasonable certainty. Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan departed Lae, New Guinea with enough fuel for roughly 20 hours of flight. They could not find Howland Island. Their radio communications were hampered by equipment limitations and coordination failures. At some point on the morning of July 2, 1937, they ran out of fuel. What happened next? Whether they ditched in the open ocean, landed on a reef, or made it to an island, remains unknown. The Pacific Ocean covers 63 million square miles. Howland Island is a speck of coral smaller than a shopping mall parking lot. In 1937, finding it required a navigator looking at the stars through a handheld sextant from a vibrating cockpit, and a pilot trusting a radio system that barely worked. The real mystery isn't that Amelia Earhart disappeared, it's that she almost made it. The answer is almost certainly sitting on the ocean floor, 16,000 feet down, in the dark. Whether anyone ever reaches it, that's the question. Dear Editor, this is the murderer of the 2 teenagers last Christmas at Lake Herman and the girl on the 4th of July. To prove I killed them, I shall state some facts which only I and the police know. On August 1st, 1969, 3 newspapers in the San Francisco Bay Area, the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald, each received a handwritten letter. Each letter contained 1/3 of a 408-symbol cipher. The writer demanded the newspapers publish the ciphers on their front pages. If they didn't, he wrote, he would go on a killing rampage. He signed the letters with a symbol, a circle with a crosshair through it. He would later give himself a name, the Zodiac. The killings had already begun. On December 20th, 1968, David Faraday, 17, and Betty Lou Jensen, 16, were parked on a gravel turnout on Lake Herman Road outside Vallejo, California. It was a popular spot for young couples. Someone approached the car. Faraday was shot once in the head while sitting in the vehicle. Jensen made it out and ran about 30 feet before being shot 5 times in the back. She died at the scene. Faraday died en route to the hospital. There was no apparent motive, no robbery, no sexual assault. The killer simply walked up, fired, and left. Vallejo police had no suspects, no witnesses, and almost no physical evidence. It looked like a random act, impossible to solve without a break. The break came 6 months later, but not in the way anyone expected. On July 4th, 1969, Darlene Farron, 22, and Mike Mago, 19, were parked at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo, about 4 miles from the Lake Herman Road site. Around midnight, a car pulled up beside them. A man got out, walked to the passenger side, and opened fire with a 9mm handgun. Mago was hit but survived. Farron was killed. 40 minutes after the shooting, someone called the Vallejo Police Department from a payphone. The caller's voice was flat, almost mechanical. "I want to report a murder. If you will go 1 mile east on Columbus Parkway to the public park, you will find kids in a brown car. They were shot with a 9mm Luger. I also killed those kids last year. Goodbye." Majo survived his injuries and later described the shooter, a stocky man about 5 feet 8 inches tall, with a round face and curly, light brown hair. It was the only eyewitness description police would ever get. The letters that arrived on August 1st, 1969 changed everything. The Zodiac wasn't just killing, he was performing. He wanted an audience. The 3-part 408-symbol cipher was cracked within a week by Donald and Betty Harden, a schoolteacher and his wife from Salinas, California. The decoded message read, in part, "I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all." The message continued with a claim that his victims would become his slaves in the afterlife, a bizarre, possibly delusional belief system that investigators never fully understood. But the Zodiac also sent a second cipher, the 340 cipher, that proved far more resistant. It remained unsolved for 51 years. In December 2020, a team of 3 codebreakers, David Oranchak, Sam Blake, and Jarl Van Eyck, finally cracked it using computational methods. The decoded text was less revealing than hoped. "I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me. I am not afraid of the gas chamber because it will send me to paradise all the sooner." No name, no confession beyond what was already known. The Zodiac was taunting them even through his ciphers. On September 27, 1969, the Zodiac attacked again, but this time he appeared in person in a way that defied any profile. At Lake Berryessa in Napa County, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were picnicking on the shore when a man approached wearing a hooded costume with the crosshair symbol sewn onto the chest. He carried a knife and a gun. He told them he was an escaped convict who needed their car and money. He had Shepard tie Hartnell's hands, then he tied Shepard's. Then he stabbed them both repeatedly. Hartnell 6 times, Shepard 10 times. Hartnell survived. Shepard died 2 days later in the hospital. Before leaving the scene, the Zodiac walked to Hartnell's car and wrote on the door with a black felt tip marker the dates and locations of his previous attacks, capped with a crosshair symbol. An hour later, someone called the Napa police from a payphone. He said in the same flat, calm voice, "I want to report a murder. No, a double murder. They are 2 miles north of park headquarters. They were in a white Volkswagen Karmann Ghia." A palm print was lifted from the phone. It was never matched. 2 weeks later, on October 11, 1969, the Zodiac killed for the last confirmed time. Paul Stein, a 29-year-old taxi driver, picked up a fare in downtown San Francisco. The passenger directed Stein to the intersection of Washington and Cherry Streets in the Presidio Heights neighborhood. There, the passenger shot Stein once in the head with a 9mm pistol, took his wallet and car keys, and tore a piece from Stein's blood-soaked shirt. 3 teenagers watched the attack from a window across the street. They called the police. A patrol car arrived within minutes, and officers Donald Fook and Eric Zelms passed a man walking calmly away from the scene. Due to a dispatch error that described the suspect as a black male rather than a white male, they did not stop him. Officer Fook later provided a description. A white male about 35 to 45 years old, stocky build, crew-cut hair, wearing glasses. This became the basis for the famous Zodiac composite sketch. The torn shirt fragment appeared in subsequent Zodiac letters, proving the letter writer and the killer were the same person. Over the decades, thousands of suspects have been investigated. The most prominent remains Arthur Lee Allen, a Vallejo resident who was investigated multiple times during his lifetime. Allen was identified by Mike Majo in a 1991 photo lineup. His acquaintances reported disturbing statements. He owned a Zodiac brand watch with the crosshair logo, but Allen was never charged. His handwriting didn't match. His fingerprints didn't match. A 2002 DNA analysis of saliva from a Zodiac letter envelope excluded him, though that DNA may have come from someone other than the Zodiac who licked the envelope. Allen died in 1992. In 2021, a group called the Casebreakers publicly named Gary Francis Post as the Zodiac, claiming they had identified him through forensic evidence. Their claims were met with skepticism from law enforcement. The FBI and San Francisco Police Department stated the case remains open. The truth is, we don't know. 57 years of investigation have produced circumstantial cases against multiple individuals, but definitive proof against none. The Zodiac may have been a person already investigated and dismissed. He may have died decades ago, never suspected. He may have simply stopped killing, something serial killers rarely do, and lived out an ordinary life. The Zodiac claimed 37 victims in his letters. Police have confirmed 5 murders and 2 survivors. The true number may be somewhere in between, or exactly what the official record states. Serial killers lie. That's what they do. What made the Zodiac different wasn't his body count. It was relatively low compared to other serial killers. It was his theater. The letters, the ciphers, the costume at Lake Berryessa, the phone calls in a dead, calm voice. He wasn't just killing. He was building a mythology, and he succeeded. The case remains officially open with the FBI, the San Francisco Police Department, and the Vallejo Police Department. Tips still come in. DNA technology continues to advance. Genetic genealogy, the method that identified the Golden State Killer in 2018, could theoretically be applied if viable DNA from the Zodiac letters can be extracted. But here's the uncomfortable possibility. The Zodiac may never be identified, not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because the right person was never in the database, never arrested, never swabbed, never suspected by anyone who mattered. Somewhere, perhaps in an attic or a storage unit, there may be a box of belongings that once belonged to a man who terrorized San Francisco, and the person sorting through that box has no idea what they're holding. Who was the Zodiac? After all these decades, does anyone really know? At 7:17 in the morning on June 30th, 1908, something streaked across the sky over central Siberia. Witnesses hundreds of miles away described a column of blue-white light, brighter than the sun, moving almost horizontally across the horizon. Then it exploded. The blast released energy estimated between 10 and 30 megatons of TNT, roughly 1,000 times the yield of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. 80 million trees were flattened across an area of 830 square miles of taiga forest. The shockwave knocked people off their feet 40 miles away. Seismographs across Europe registered the impact. Barometric pressure sensors in England detected the atmospheric wave twice as it circled the entire planet. Nothing hit the ground. There was no crater. Whatever it was, it detonated in midair. And for over a century, we've been trying to figure out what it was. The explosion occurred over the Podkamanaya Tunguska River, a sparsely populated region inhabited primarily by the Evenki, an indigenous nomadic people. Because of the remote location, there were no immediate casualties recorded, though Evenki oral histories describe herders being thrown from their feet and tents being blown away. The nearest Russian settlement was the trading post of Vanavara, about 40 miles from the epicenter. Witnesses there reported a flash of light followed by a sound like artillery fire. One trader, Semyon Semyonov, later recalled, "The sky split in two and fire appeared high and wide over the forest. The heat was so intense I felt as if my shirt was on fire." Hundreds of miles further away, the Trans-Siberian Railway passengers saw the flash. In Irkutsk, roughly 550 miles distant, seismographs recorded what they initially classified as an earthquake. But the most striking effect was visible across Europe. For several nights after June 30th, the skies over Britain, Scandinavia, and Western Russia glowed with an eerie, silvery luminescence. People in London could read newspapers outdoors at midnight. These were likely noctilucent clouds, ice crystals in the upper atmosphere, scattered by the debris plume. The energy release was staggering. Modern analysis has refined the estimates, with most researchers settling on approximately 12 megatons, roughly equivalent to the yield of the largest U.S. nuclear weapon ever tested in the atmosphere. The shockwave registered on seismometers as far as Jena, Germany, over 3,000 miles away. The atmospheric pressure wave was detected by barographs at stations across Europe, including one in Potsdam that recorded it passing twice, once going east and once returning from the opposite direction after circling the globe. Trees were flattened in a distinctive butterfly-shaped pattern radiating outward from the epicenter, with a peculiar feature at the center. Directly beneath the blast, trees remained standing, but were stripped of all their branches, left as bare poles pointing straight up. This pattern is consistent with a downward-directed shockwave from an airburst, an explosion occurring several miles above the ground. The butterfly pattern, rather than a perfect circle, suggests the object was traveling at an angle, entering the atmosphere from the southeast and detonating while still in motion. Despite the scale of the event, no scientific expedition reached the site for 19 years. Russia in 1908 was on the brink of revolution. The region was extraordinarily remote, and frankly, an explosion in the uninhabited taiga was not a priority for a crumbling empire. In 1927, Soviet mineralogist Leonid Kulik organized the first scientific expedition to the epicenter. He expected to find a massive impact crater and meteorite fragments, a discovery that would bring prestige to Soviet science. What he found shocked him. The devastation was total. For miles in every direction, trees lay flattened on the ground, all pointing away from a central point. But at that central point, nothing. No crater, no rocks, no fragments. Kulik conducted 3 more expeditions through the 1930s. He drained a nearby bog, thinking it might be a filled-in crater. He drilled into the permafrost. He searched systematically for meteorite fragments. He found nothing extraterrestrial. He was convinced the answer was buried somewhere in the swampy ground. He died in a German prisoner of war camp in 1942, never having solved the mystery. The absence of a crater is the defining puzzle of the Tunguska event. Every known meteor impact of comparable energy has left a crater. The Barringer crater in Arizona, formed by an object releasing roughly 10 megatons, is 3/4 of a mile wide and 560 feet deep. Yet at Tunguska, nothing. This led to the now accepted explanation, an airburst. The object, whatever it was, exploded at an altitude estimated between 5 and 10 kilometers above the surface. It never reached the ground. The blast wave propagated downward and outward, flattening the forest, but no solid material impacted the surface. Airbursts are not theoretical. On February 15, 2013, a 20-meter asteroid entered the atmosphere over Chelyabinsk, Russia, and detonated at an altitude of about 30 kilometers. The explosion released approximately 500 kilotons of energy, about 30 times less than Tunguska, and still shattered windows across 6 cities, injuring roughly 1,500 people. The Tunguska object was likely 50 to 80 meters in diameter. The Chelyabinsk object was 20 meters. The difference in energy is not linear, it's cubic. A slightly larger rock produces a vastly more powerful explosion. So what was it? An asteroid or a comet? The distinction matters. An asteroid is rock and metal. A comet is ice and dust. If a comet exploded in the atmosphere, it would leave virtually no surviving fragments. The ice would vaporize completely. This would explain why Kulik and every subsequent expedition found no extraterrestrial material at the site. The comet hypothesis was championed in the 1930s by British astronomer Francis Whipple and later by Soviet astrophysicist Vasily Fesenkov. It fits several observations: the absence of fragments, the noctilucent clouds, which could have been caused by water vapor and dust injected into the upper atmosphere, and the bright night skies over Europe. However, more recent studies have complicated the picture. In 2013, a team led by Viktor Kvasnitsia published findings in the journal Planetary and Space Science, reporting the discovery of microscopic fragments in the Tunguska soil, tiny diamonds and Lonsdaleite crystals consistent with a stony asteroid that fragmented under extreme heat and pressure. If confirmed, this would support the asteroid hypothesis. As of now, there is no consensus. The most widely cited model, published by researchers including Mark Boslow at Sandia National Laboratories, favors a stony asteroid of about 60 meters that disintegrated in the atmosphere. But the comet theory has not been definitively ruled out. Over the decades, the Tunguska event has attracted more speculative theories than almost any other natural event. Nikola Tesla allegedly claimed, or was claimed by others to have claimed, that his Wardenclyffe Tower experiments caused the explosion. There is no credible evidence for this. The tower was never operational at the time. Others have proposed antimatter, a miniature black hole passing through the Earth, a natural hydrogen gas explosion from the permafrost, or even an alien spacecraft. None of these theories have scientific support. The antimatter theory was proposed semi-seriously by physicists Lincoln LaPaz and Clyde Cowan in the 1960s, but it would have produced a distinctive gamma-ray signature that was never detected. What is scientifically established is this. An object entered the atmosphere at hypersonic speed, superheated the air around it, and detonated with the force of a large thermonuclear weapon. Whether it was rock or ice, it was between 50 and 80 meters across, and it arrived at a steep angle from the southeast. The planet got lucky. The explosion occurred over one of the most remote, uninhabited regions on Earth. Had it arrived 4 hours and 52 minutes later, Earth's rotation would have placed St. Petersburg directly beneath it, a city of nearly 2 million people in 1908. Here's the unsettling truth about the Tunguska event. It will happen again. The question is not if, but when and where. NASA's Center for Near-Earth Object Studies currently tracks over 34,000 near-Earth asteroids. Of these, roughly 2,300 are classified as potentially hazardous, but objects the size of the Tunguska impactor, 50 to 80 meters, are extremely difficult to detect before they arrive. The Chelyabinsk asteroid in 2013 was completely undetected until it hit the atmosphere. Current planetary defense efforts, including NASA's DART mission, which successfully deflected the asteroid Dimorphos in 2022, are designed for much larger objects detected years in advance. A Tunguska-class object on a collision course could arrive with days or hours of warning, or none at all. In 1908, the blast flattened empty forest. The next one might not land in an empty forest. The Tunguska event isn't just a mystery, it's a warning. And the sky doesn't issue those twice. The afternoon before Thanksgiving, 1971, a man in a dark suit and tie walked up to the Northwest Orient Airlines ticket counter at Portland International Airport. He paid $20 cash for a one-way ticket to Seattle. He gave the name Dan Cooper, a name that later became D.B. Cooper through a media error that stuck. He was described as white, mid-40s, roughly 6 feet tall, 170 to 180 pounds, with dark hair. He was calm, polite, and unremarkable. He took his seat, 18C, a middle seat near the rear of the Boeing 727-100, ordered a bourbon and soda, and lit a cigarette. He looked like any other business traveler. Within 2 hours, he would execute one of the most audacious crimes in American history and vanish into the night sky. Shortly after takeoff, Cooper handed a folded note to Florence Schaffner, one of the flight attendants. She assumed it was a phone number. Passengers hit on her regularly, and slipped it into her pocket without reading it. Cooper leaned over and said quietly, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." The note stated his demands: $200,000 in negotiable American currency, 4 parachutes, 2 primary and 2 reserve, and a fuel truck standing by in Seattle for immediate refueling. Schaffner walked to the back of the plane and sat next to Cooper. He opened a briefcase and showed her what appeared to be red cylinders wired to a battery, consistent with dynamite sticks, though it was never confirmed to be a functional device. Schaffner later described Cooper as calm, businesslike, not nervous. He wasn't aggressive. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stated his terms and waited. The note was never recovered. Cooper asked for it back after Schaffner read it, and it was presumably destroyed or taken with him during the jump. The pilot, Captain William Scott, radioed the demands to air traffic control. Northwest Orient President Donald Nyrop authorized full compliance. Company policy was to cooperate with hijackers to protect passengers. While the plane circled Puget Sound for nearly 2 hours, the FBI assembled the ransom. 10,000 unmarked $20 bills, all with serial numbers recorded on microfilm. They also secured 4 parachutes from a local skydiving school. At 5:39 p.m., the plane landed at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Cooper instructed that the 36 passengers be released in exchange for the money and parachutes delivered via the rear stairs. The exchange was completed. The passengers disembarked, most of them unaware a hijacking had taken place. Cooper had kept the situation contained to the rear of the aircraft. Cooper then ordered the remaining crew, Captain Scott, First Officer William Radijak, Flight Engineer Harold Anderson, and Flight Attendant Tina Mucklow to fly to Mexico City with a refueling stop in Reno, Nevada. He specified the flight parameters: altitude no higher than 10,000 feet, airspeed below 200 knots, wing flaps at 15 degrees, and landing gear deployed. These were the conditions that would allow the rear air stair to be opened in flight. The crew complied. At approximately 7:40 p.m., the Boeing 727 took off from Seattle heading south. At approximately 8:13 p.m., as the plane flew over the Lewis River area in southwest Washington state, the crew noticed a sudden change in cabin pressure and a warning light indicating the rear air stair had been deployed. The aircraft's tail pitched slightly, an oscillation consistent with the sudden weight shift of a person stepping off the stairs into the airstream. Cooper was gone. He jumped into darkness, into rain, into temperatures near freezing, at roughly 200 miles per hour over dense Pacific Northwest forest with no visible landmarks. He was carrying approximately 21 pounds of $20 bills in a canvas bank bag, wearing loafers, a thin business suit, and a clip-on tie, which he left behind on the plane. The clip-on tie was the most significant physical evidence. In 2011, the FBI's Tom Kay found microscopic particles embedded in it, pure titanium, cerium, and strontium sulfide, suggesting Cooper may have worked in the chemical or aerospace industry, possibly at a company using specialty metals. Whether Cooper survived the jump is the central question of the entire case. The FBI launched one of its most extensive manhunts in history. 18 days of ground searches covered the estimated drop zone, a strip roughly 20 miles long and 5 miles wide between the towns of Ariel and La Center in southwest Washington. They found nothing. Hundreds of Army troops, FBI agents, and local volunteers combed through old-growth forest, swampland, and riverbanks. Helicopters surveyed from above. Nothing. No parachute, no money, no body, no clothing. The terrain worked against them. Dense Douglas fir and western red cedar canopy would have concealed a parachute landing. The November rain would have washed away tracks. And the area was enormous. There was no way to be certain of the exact drop point because Cooper's location on the aircraft and the timing of his jump could only be estimated. The FBI kept the case open for 45 years. Over that time, they investigated more than 1,000 suspects. None was ever charged. In July 2016, the FBI officially suspended active investigation, stating, "Every prior tip has been prior investigated to prior conclusion." They acknowledged the case was effectively cold. On February 10, 1980, 8-year-old Brian Ingram was digging a fire pit on Tina Bar, a sandy beach along the Columbia River near Vancouver, Washington. He uncovered 3 bundles of badly deteriorated 20 bills, a total of $5,800. The serial numbers matched Cooper's ransom. This is the only ransom money ever recovered. But the discovery raised more questions than it answered. Tina Bar is roughly 20 miles southwest of the estimated drop zone and downstream on the Columbia River. The bills showed significant water and soil damage consistent with years of burial. How did the money get there? One theory is that Cooper landed in or near the Columbia River and the money washed downstream. Another is that it was deliberately buried. A geological study in 2020 by sedimentologist Thomas Kay concluded the money was likely deposited by a dredging operation in 1974, which had pulled sediment from the river bottom onto the beach, meaning the money had been in the river itself for some time before being relocated to the sand. If Cooper landed in the river, survival would have been nearly impossible in November conditions. Water temperatures around 40 degrees Fahrenheit in the dark. The list of suspects is long and contested. The most prominent include Richard Floyd McCoy, a former Green Beret who hijacked a United Airlines flight in 1972 using an almost identical method and was caught 2 days later. McCoy was a trained paratrooper, and the parallels were striking. But he was killed in a shootout with the FBI in 1974, and the Bureau never formally named him as Cooper. His physical description didn't match. Robert Rackstraw, a decorated Vietnam veteran with a history of fraud and identity theft, was publicly named by investigative journalist Tom Colbert in 2016. Colbert's team claimed to have decoded messages in Cooper's letters. The FBI was unimpressed. Kenneth Christensen, a former Army paratrooper and Northwest Orient purser, was nominated by his brother. Christensen reportedly made deathbed statements suggesting involvement, but he was shorter and lighter than Cooper's description. And there are dozens more, each with circumstantial connections, each lacking definitive proof. This is what it comes down to. A man with no demonstrable parachuting experience jumped from a commercial airliner at 10,000 feet at night in freezing rain over unlit forest, wearing loafers and a business suit, carrying 21 pounds of cash. Experienced skydivers have called the jump survivable but extremely dangerous. The parachute Cooper selected, a military NB-8, was functional but not steerable. He would have descended at roughly 15 feet per second in darkness with no ability to choose his landing zone. Dense forest, water, or terrain features could have been fatal. The fact that the parachute was never found suggests one of three possibilities. Cooper landed in the deep forest where the canopy swallowed all evidence. He landed in water and sank, or someone recovered the parachute and never reported it. And here's the detail that keeps this case alive. The money found at Tina Bar accounted for only $5,800 of the $200,000. Where are the other 9,710 bills? In 45 years, not a single additional bill has surfaced. Not in a bank, not at a store, not in circulation anywhere. If Cooper survived, he never spent the money. And if he didn't survive, nobody ever found it. Either way, D.B. Cooper pulled off something no one has done before or since. He hijacked an airplane, collected a ransom, and disappeared. Whether he lived to enjoy it or died in the forest is almost beside the point. The mystery is the legacy. What do you think? Did he walk out of those woods? Somewhere inside Yale University's Voynich Rare Book and Manuscript Library sits a 240-page book written in a language no one on Earth can read. Not the CIA, not the NSA, not the world's greatest cryptographers, linguists, or artificial intelligence systems. For over a century, it has resisted every single attempt at translation, and we still don't know who wrote it, what it says, or why it exists. This is the Voynich manuscript, and it might be the most mysterious document in human history. In 1912, a Polish-born book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich purchased a collection of old manuscripts from the Jesuit order at Villa Mondragone near Rome. Among them was an unassuming volume, small, roughly the size of a modern paperback, filled with bizarre illustrations and an unknown script. Voynich immediately recognized he had something extraordinary. He spent years trying to trace its origins. A letter found tucked inside, written in 1665 by Johannes Marcus Marci, rector of Prague University, revealed that the manuscript had once belonged to Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, who allegedly paid 600 gold ducats for it, roughly equivalent to $250,000 today. Marci believed it was the work of Roger Bacon, the 13th century English friar and early scientific thinker. That attribution has since been largely dismissed. Radiocarbon dating, conducted by the University of Arizona in 2009, placed the manuscript's vellum firmly in the early 15th century, between 1404 and 1438. The ink and paints are consistent with that period. So whoever made this, they made it 600 years ago. The manuscript is divided into sections based on its illustrations. There's a botanical section with drawings of plants, except most of these plants don't exist. They don't match any known species. Some appear to be composites, as if someone took the roots of one plant, the leaves of another, and the flower of a third. There's an astronomical section with circular diagrams that resemble zodiac charts and celestial maps. A biological section shows small human figures, mostly women, bathing in pools connected by elaborate plumbing systems filled with green and blue liquid. A pharmaceutical section depicts jars and vessels alongside more unidentifiable plants. And a final recipe section consists of dense blocks of text with star-shaped markers in the margins. Every page is hand-painted. The effort involved was enormous. This was not a casual undertaking. Someone invested months, possibly years, creating this object. The text itself is where things get truly strange. It's written in an alphabet of roughly 20 to 25 distinct characters, flowing left to right in a consistent hand. Statistical analysis shows it has properties that real languages have: predictable letter frequencies, word length distributions, and something resembling Zipf's law, which governs how often words appear in natural text. But it also breaks rules that all known languages follow. Words repeat far more than they should. Certain characters appear almost exclusively at the beginning or end of words, in rigid patterns that no natural language exhibits. Some researchers believe this points to an artificial or constructed language. Others argue it could be a natural language written in an unfamiliar encoding system. Here's the most unsettling part. There are virtually no corrections anywhere in the manuscript. No crossed-out words, no insertions. Whoever wrote this either copied it flawlessly from another source, composed it perfectly on the first attempt, or simply wrote down whatever came to mind, because it doesn't actually mean anything. During World War II, some of the greatest codebreakers in history tried their hand at the Voynich. William Friedman, the man who cracked Japan's purple cipher, spent decades on it. He ultimately concluded it was an early attempt at creating a universal language, though he couldn't prove it. The NSA took a crack at it in the 1950s and failed. British codebreakers examined it, academic linguists studied it, none succeeded. In the age of computers, brute force approaches have been applied: frequency analysis, neural networks, pattern matching, and while they've generated headlines claiming breakthroughs, none have produced a verifiable, consistent translation. In 2014, a retired botanist named Arthur Tucker claimed the plant illustrations matched species found in 16th century Mexico, suggesting the manuscript might be Aztec in origin. In 2017, a television researcher named Nicholas Gibbs declared it was a medieval women's health guide, written in abbreviated Latin. In 2019, a computer scientist named Gerard Cheshire said it was written in Proto-Romance. All three claims were largely rejected by experts in the field. The theories cluster into three broad camps. First, it's a genuine text in a lost or obscure language, possibly an extinct dialect, a private cipher, or an early constructed language. The statistical properties of the text support this. It behaves enough like real language to make this plausible. Second, it's an elaborate hoax. The most frequently cited suspect is Edward Kelly, a known forger and occultist who worked in Prague around the time Rudolph II allegedly purchased the manuscript. Kelly had both the motive, money, and the skills to fabricate something convincing. However, the radiocarbon dating predates Kelly by over a century. Third, and this is the theory that keeps linguists up at night, it could be meaningful text obscured by a method we simply haven't figured out yet. A steganographic system where the real message is hidden within the visible text using a key we don't have. If that's the case, it might be genuinely unbreakable without the key. Recent multispectral imaging has revealed details invisible to the naked eye: faded text, erased markings, and underdrawings that suggest the illustrations were carefully planned, not improvised. This argues against the hoax theory, since a forger would be unlikely to invest that level of hidden effort. DNA analysis of the vellum confirmed it came from multiple calves, at least 15 different animals, meaning the material alone represented significant expense. Protein analysis of the inks showed they're consistent with medieval European practice. In 2020, a team at the University of Alberta applied artificial intelligence to the text and tentatively suggested Hebrew as the underlying language, with the letters rearranged through an alphagram system. But their results were met with skepticism, and no independent team has been able to replicate the findings. The manuscript now lives in climate-controlled storage at Yale, cataloged as MS-408. It has been fully digitized and is freely available online. Thousands of amateur codebreakers work on it every year. None have succeeded. 600 years after its creation, the Voynich manuscript remains the only known historical document of significant length that has never been deciphered. Not partially, not tentatively, not at all. In an age where we can sequence genomes, photograph black holes, and train machines to write poetry, this small, hand-painted book from the 15th century remains completely, stubbornly opaque. Maybe one day someone will find the key. Or maybe the Voynich manuscript is exactly what it appears to be, a message from 6 centuries ago that was never meant for us to read. What do you think? Is the Voynich a genuine cipher, a medical text in disguise, or the most elaborate hoax in history? Tell us in the comments. On the afternoon of December 5, 1872, about 400 miles east of the Azores Islands in the Atlantic Ocean, the British brig Dei Gratia spotted a sail on the horizon. Captain David Morehouse looked through his spyglass. He recognized the vessel. It was an American merchant ship named the Mary Celeste. It was sailing erratically on a port tack, yawing slightly, its sails partially set but untended. Morehouse knew the captain of the Mary Celeste, Benjamin Briggs. The two ships had been docked near each other in New York just a month earlier. Morehouse signaled the vessel, no reply. The deck was completely empty. The Dei Gratia closed the distance, and Morehouse sent his chief mate Oliver Deveau over in a small boat. When Deveau climbed aboard, what he found became the greatest maritime mystery in history. The ship was perfectly sound, the cargo was intact, but the captain, his wife, their 2-year-old daughter, and the 7 crewmen were completely gone. The Mary Celeste was a 100-foot brigantine, a 2-masted sailing vessel designed for transatlantic cargo. It had a troubled history, suffering multiple accidents and a change of name earlier in its life. But by late 1872, under the command of Captain Benjamin Briggs, it was considered a sturdy, reliable ship. Briggs was an experienced, highly respected master mariner from a seafaring Massachusetts family. He was not a man to panic or abandon a ship lightly. On November 7, 1872, the Mary Celeste sailed from Staten Island, New York, bound for Genoa, Italy. On board were Briggs, his wife Sarah, their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia, and a crew of 7 experienced sailors, 4 Germans, 2 Americans, and a Dane. In the ship's hold was a specialized cargo, 1,701 barrels of commercial industrial alcohol. For the first 2 weeks, everything seemed normal. The ship's logbook recorded routine progress across the Atlantic. When Chief Mate Oliver Deveau boarded the Mary Celeste on December 5th, he found a scene that defied logic. The ship was in good condition, the hull was sound, there was about 3.5 feet of water in the hold, a normal amount for a wooden ship on a transatlantic voyage, nothing the pumps couldn't handle. The pumps themselves were in working order. The ship's logbook lay on the mate's desk. The last entry was dated November 24th, placing the ship about 400 miles west of where it was found. Between November 24th and December 5th, the ship had sailed itself. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no damage to suggest a massive storm or a rogue wave. In the captain's cabin, everything was undisturbed. Mrs. Briggs's sewing machine sat ready. A harmonium, a small organ, was closed. Personal belongings, including valuables, were untouched. The crew's quarters contained their sea chests, clothes, and pipes. Sailors do not leave their pipes behind unless they are in extreme haste. But some things were missing. The ship's papers and navigational instruments, the sextant, marine chronometer, and ship's register were gone. The compass binnacle was broken, possibly in a rush. Most importantly, the ship's single, small yawl, its only lifeboat, was missing. The davits, the mechanisms used to lower the boat, were empty, and a long, heavy towing rope, known as a main peak halyard, was found trailing in the water behind the Mary Celeste. The evidence painted a clear but baffling picture. Captain Briggs had ordered everyone off a perfectly sound ship into a tiny open lifeboat in the middle of the ocean. He had taken his wife and toddler into freezing, turbulent Atlantic swells, tying their small boat to the stern of the larger ship using the trailing rope. Then the rope snapped or was cut, and the Mary Celeste sailed away from them. Why would an experienced captain do this? The crew of the Dei Gratia sailed the Mary Celeste to Gibraltar, arriving on December 13th, hoping to claim a salvage reward for bringing in an abandoned vessel. Instead, they ran into Frederick Solly Flood, the Attorney General of Gibraltar. Solly Flood was a suspicious theatrical prosecutor who immediately assumed the worst. He launched a salvage court inquiry, convinced that foul play was involved. Solly Flood theorized that the crew of the Dei Gratia had murdered the crew of the Mary Celeste to claim the salvage money. Alternatively, he suggested the Mary Celeste crew had mutinied, murdered Briggs and his family, and fled in the lifeboat. Solly Flood pointed to what he believed were bloodstains on a sword found in the captain's cabin, and alleged damage to the ship's rails. But forensic analysis later proved the blood was just rust, and the rail damage was normal wear and tear. The court eventually awarded the De Gracia crew a fraction of the salvage value, but the suspicion lingered, and the mystery deepened. In the decades following the discovery, theories multiplied. Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, wrote a sensational fictionalized account in 1884 called J. Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement, which popularized the spelling Marie Celeste and cemented the idea of a bloody mutiny in the public mind. But mutiny makes no sense. The crew of the Mary Celeste were known as reliable, peaceful sailors. If they had mutinied, why did they take the captain's wife and child with them into the lifeboat? Why did they leave behind their own belongings and their pay? And if they had survived to reach land, why did none of them ever surface again? Other theories invoked giant squids, pirate attacks, and the Bermuda Triangle, even though the ship was found near the Azores, thousands of miles from the Bermuda Triangle. The answer has to explain why a rational captain deliberately abandoned his ship. One plausible theory is that the ship encountered a seaquake, an underwater earthquake. The Azores region is seismically active. A severe seaquake could have violently shaken the ship, causing water in the bilges to slosh up around the sounding rod, the dipstick used to measure water in the hold. If Briggs checked the rod right after a quake, it might have falsely indicated that the ship was rapidly taking on water. Believing the ship was sinking, Briggs might have ordered an immediate evacuation into the yawl, tying it to the ship's stern. When he realized the ship wasn't sinking, he couldn't get back aboard because the Mary Celeste, with its sails still set, caught a sudden wind. The tow line snapped under the strain, leaving 10 people in a small boat watching their only chance of survival sail over the horizon. But this theory doesn't account for the cargo. The most scientifically supported theory focuses on the 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol in the hold. When the De Gracia crew opened the main hatch, they reported a strong smell of alcohol fumes. Upon inspection, 9 of the barrels were found to be empty. They were made of red oak, which is more porous than the white oak used for the rest of the barrels. Dr. Andrea Sella, a chemist at University College London, conducted an experiment in 2006. He built a replica of the ship's hold and filled it with butane gas, simulating the leaked alcohol fumes. He then ignited a spark. The result was a pressure wave type of combustion, a massive flash of blue flame that blew open the hatch doors but was incredibly cool. It left no soot, no burn marks, and no structural damage. If this happened on the Mary Celeste, Briggs would have seen a terrifying explosion of blue fire roaring out of the cargo hold. Fearing a massive fire, he ordered everyone into the lifeboat instantly. He trailed the boat behind the ship on the halyard, waiting to see if the vessel would burn. The fire went out instantly. There was no more fuel vapor. But then the wind picked up. The massive, heavy brigantine surged forward. The tow rope snapped. Captain Benjamin Briggs made a rational decision based on terrifying evidence. He abandoned a ship he thought was going to explode. By the time he realized he was wrong, the ship was gone, and 10 people were left to die in the middle of the Atlantic. In August 1590, an English governor returned to a small settlement on the coast of what is now North Carolina. He had been gone for 3 years, far longer than planned. When he arrived, the colony was empty. The houses had been dismantled. The fortifications were gone. Over 100 men, women, and children, including the governor's own granddaughter, the first English child born in the Americas, had disappeared without a trace. The only clue was a single word carved into a wooden post, Croatoan. No one has ever fully explained what happened to the lost colony of Roanoke, and 436 years later, we're still looking. To understand Roanoke, you need to understand the politics behind it. In the 1580s, England was locked in a struggle with Spain for control of the New World. Spain had been plundering the Americas for nearly a century. England wanted in, and Sir Walter Raleigh, courtier and favorite of Queen Elizabeth I, held the royal patent to establish English colonies in North America. Raleigh never went himself. Instead, he sent expeditions. The first, in 1584, was exploratory. Two ships that scouted the coast and made contact with local Algonquian-speaking peoples on Roanoke Island, a small barrier island in what the English called Virginia, a name honoring the Virgin Queen. In 1585, Raleigh sent a military colony, about 108 men under the command of Ralph Lane. This was not a settlement in any real sense. It was a garrison. Lane and his men antagonized the local Aquascogok and Socotan peoples, burned a village over a stolen silver cup, and eventually killed the Roanoke chief Wingina in a preemptive strike. When Sir Francis Drake passed by in June 1586, the colonists begged to be taken home. Drake obliged. England's first attempt at colonization was a disaster of its own making. But Raleigh wasn't done. In 1587, Raleigh organized a new expedition, different in character. This time, the colonists would include families, men, women, and children. The plan was to establish a permanent, self-sustaining settlement on the Chesapeake Bay. Their leader was John White, an artist and mapmaker who had been part of the 1585 expedition and whose watercolors of the Algonquian people remain some of the most important ethnographic records of the era. The expedition comprised roughly 117 colonists, including White's pregnant daughter Eleanor Dare. Their ship arrived at Roanoke Island in July 1587. The plan had been to stop briefly before continuing to Chesapeake Bay, but the ship's pilot, Simão Fernandes, a Portuguese navigator, refused to take them further. The reasons remained disputed. The colonists were stuck on Roanoke. They rebuilt the old fortification. They tried to re-establish relations with the local peoples, which proved difficult given what Ralph Lane had done 2 years earlier. The Croatoan people, who lived on a nearby island now called Hatteras, remained friendly. Most other groups refused contact. On August 18, 1587, Eleanor Dare gave birth to Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas. 9 days later, her father, John White, boarded a ship back to England to get supplies. He expected to return within months. White arrived in England in November 1587 and immediately began organizing a resupply mission. But history intervened. In 1588, the Spanish Armada sailed against England. Queen Elizabeth ordered every available ship pressed into defense. No vessels could be spared for colonial resupply. White made 2 attempts to return. In 1588, he sailed with 2 small pinnaces loaded with supplies, but the ship's captains decided to pursue piracy en route, were themselves captured by French pirates, and limped back to England with their cargo stolen. In 1589, Raleigh's patent was reassigned, complicating logistics further. It was not until March 1590, nearly 3 years after White had left Roanoke, that he finally secured passage on a privateering expedition willing to detour to the colony. The delay was not indifference. White wrote agonized letters throughout this period. His daughter, his granddaughter, and over 100 people were waiting for supplies he couldn't deliver. White's fleet arrived at the Outer Banks on August 15, 1590. The approach was dangerous. The seas were rough, and 2 of his men drowned when their boat capsized crossing the bar. When the surviving party finally reached the settlement on August 18th, Virginia Dare's 3rd birthday, they found it abandoned. The houses had been carefully taken down. This was not destruction. It was systematic dismantlement. The palisade fence had been rebuilt into a different configuration, and the trees within the enclosure had been stripped of bark. The colonists' chests had been dug up from where they'd been buried. White had instructed them to hide valuables, and broken open, their contents scattered and ruined by weather. There were no bodies, no graves, no signs of violence, no Maltese cross, the agreed-upon distress signal that White and the colonists had arranged before his departure. What White found instead was that word, Croatoan, carved into a post of the palisade, and the letters Crow carved into a nearby tree. Croatoan was the name of both a people and an island, the same Hatteras Island where the friendly Croatoan people lived, about 50 miles south. White was convinced his colonists had relocated there. He desperately wanted to sail to Croatoan Island to find them, but a storm blew in. His ship's anchors were dragging. The captain refused to risk the fleet. They were forced out to sea and eventually back to England. John White never returned to America. He spent his remaining years on Raleigh's estates in Ireland, writing about his lost colony. He died around 1593, never knowing what happened to his daughter, his granddaughter, or the people he'd been charged with protecting. No English expedition successfully searched Croatoan Island for the colonists. Despite the most obvious lead in the entire mystery, a carved message literally telling them where to look, no one followed up for decades. The most widely accepted theory among modern historians is integration. The colonists, running low on food and facing a severe drought, which tree ring data has confirmed was the worst in 800 years, likely dispersed and were absorbed into local indigenous communities. The Croatoan were allies. Other groups, like the Chespian of the Chesapeake Bay area, may also have taken in survivors. When the Jamestown settlers arrived in 1607, they heard persistent reports from the Powhatan Confederacy that English people were living among indigenous groups to the south. Chief Powhatan reportedly told Captain John Smith that he had ordered the killing of those English survivors shortly before Jamestown's founding, though Smith's accounts are notoriously unreliable and self-serving, and many historians question this claim. The Lumbee people of southern North Carolina have long maintained oral traditions of English ancestry. In the 18th century, European visitors to the region noted Lumbee individuals with European features, English-sounding names, and familiarity with English customs. DNA studies have been inconclusive. The genetics of a 400-year-old intermixing would be heavily diluted by now. A darker theory suggests a massacre by a hostile indigenous group, but the lack of human remains at the site argues against this. If there had been a battle, there would be bones, arrowheads, evidence of fire. There's nothing. In 2012, researchers at the British Museum re-examined one of John White's maps using modern imaging technology. Beneath a patch that White had glued over a section of the map, they found a symbol, a small star marking a location about 50 miles inland from Roanoke, at the western end of Albemarle Sound. This site, now called Site X, has been the subject of ongoing archaeological excavation. Artifacts recovered from Site Tengs include fragments of a type of pottery called Surrey Hampshire borderware, distinctly English from the late 16th century. A food storage hook known as a pricking iron, consistent with Elizabethan-era manufacture, was also found. These artifacts don't definitively prove the colonists went there. They could have arrived through trade, but they're suggestive. On Hatteras Island, the actual Croatoan, archaeologists have found even more compelling evidence. A slate writing tablet, a rapier hilt, and English-style gun hardware, all dating to the correct period. These items were found in proximity to Native American artifacts, consistent with the integration theory. The Roanoke colonists didn't simply vanish into thin air. They left a message. They dismantled their homes methodically. They took what they could carry. Every piece of evidence points to a planned departure, not a catastrophe. They likely went to the people they trusted, the Croatoan, and from there possibly dispersed further inland. The real mystery isn't what happened to them. It's why nobody came looking in time. Why an English governor's desperate pleas for a ship were ignored for 3 years. Why the most obvious clue, a carved word naming a specific place, went uninvestigated for decades. 117 people didn't disappear. England abandoned them, and history forgot them. Do you think the colonists survived by integrating with the Croatoan, or did something darker happen? Tell us what you think in the comments. At 12:30 p.m. on November 22, 1963, 3 rifle shots echoed across Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas. The President of the United States slumped forward in his open-top limousine. Within 30 minutes, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was pronounced dead at Parkland Memorial Hospital. He was 46 years old. He had been president for 1,036 days. In the 6 decades since, more than 40,000 books have been written about his assassination. 2 official government investigations reached contradictory conclusions. Thousands of documents remained classified until 2023. Polls consistently show that a majority of Americans, hovering between 60 and 70%, do not believe the official account of what happened. This is the most scrutinized murder in human history, and we still argue about it. The basic facts are not in dispute. President Kennedy was traveling in a motorcade through downtown Dallas, sitting in the rear seat of a 1961 Lincoln Continental convertible. Texas Governor John Connally sat directly in front of him. First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy sat to the president's left. The motorcade turned left from Houston Street onto Elm Street, passing the Texas School Book Depository, a 7-story warehouse on the northwest corner of Dealey Plaza. At 12:30 p.m., shots were fired. Kennedy was struck at least twice. Governor Connally was also wounded. The limousine accelerated and raced to Parkland Hospital, 4 miles away. Kennedy never regained consciousness. Within 80 minutes of the shooting, police arrested Lee Harvey Oswald, a 24-year-old employee of the Texas School Book Depository, who had also shot and killed Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit during his flight from the building. 2 days later, while being transferred between jails, Oswald was shot and killed on live television by Jack Ruby, a local nightclub owner. The suspect was dead before he could stand trial. Lee Harvey Oswald is one of the strangest figures in American history. A former Marine who had been trained as a sharpshooter, Oswald defected to the Soviet Union in 1959 at the age of 19, renouncing his American citizenship at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. He lived in Minsk for 2.5 years, married a Russian woman named Marina, then, remarkably, was allowed to return to the United States in 1962 with his wife and infant daughter, with a State Department loan to cover their travel. This alone has fueled decades of suspicion. During the height of the Cold War, a former Marine walks into the Soviet Union, stays for years, then walks back out, and neither the CIA nor the FBI takes much interest. Oswald was monitored, yes, but loosely. He was never detained or seriously debriefed upon his return. In the spring of 1963, Oswald ordered a Mannlicher Carcano rifle through a mail-order catalog under a false name. In April, he allegedly fired a shot at retired Major General Edwin Walker, a far-right political figure in Dallas. The bullet missed. No charges were filed at the time. The connection to Oswald was only established after the Kennedy assassination. By October 1963, Oswald had found work at the Texas School Book Depository. 5 weeks later, the presidential motorcade route was published in Dallas newspapers. The route passed directly beneath his workplace window. 1 week after the assassination, President Lyndon Johnson established the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy, chaired by Chief Justice Earl Warren. After 10 months of investigation, the commission issued an 888-page report in September 1964. Its core conclusions: Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. 3 shots were fired from the 6th-floor window of the book depository. 1 missed. 1 struck both Kennedy and Connally. The so-called single bullet theory, or as critics call it, the magic bullet theory. The 3rd shot struck Kennedy in the head and was fatal. Jack Ruby also acted alone, motivated by grief and a desire to spare Jacqueline Kennedy the ordeal of a trial. The report was endorsed unanimously by all 7 commissioners. It became the official account of the assassination, and almost immediately, it began to unravel in the public mind. The single bullet theory is the linchpin and the most controversial element. According to the Warren Commission, 1 bullet, designated Commission Exhibit 399, entered Kennedy's upper back, exited his throat, entered Connally's back, shattered his 5th rib, exited below his right nipple, passed through his wrist, and lodged in his thigh. The bullet was found nearly intact on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital. Critics point out that the trajectory requires the bullet to change direction multiple times, which is why they call it the magic bullet. Supporters counter that when you account for the actual seating positions, Connally's jump seat was lower and inboard of Kennedy's, the trajectory is a straight line. Computer reconstructions and ballistic tests have largely supported the single bullet trajectory, though debate continues. Then there's the Zapruder film. Abraham Zapruder, a Dallas dressmaker, captured the assassination on his 8mm home movie camera. The film shows Kennedy's head moving backward and to the left at the moment of the fatal shot, seeming to suggest the shot came from the front, not from the book depository behind the motorcade. But forensic experts note that a neurological response called a jet effect can cause the head to move toward the source of a shot, not away from it. The medical evidence, the entrance wound at the back of the skull, the exit wound at the front, is consistent with a shot from behind. The acoustics evidence muddied things further. In 1979, the House Select Committee on Assassinations analyzed a Dallas police dictabelt recording and concluded there was a 95% probability that a fourth shot was fired from the grassy knoll in front of the motorcade, meaning a second shooter, meaning a conspiracy. This finding directly contradicted the Warren Commission. However, a 1982 review by the National Academy of Sciences found the acoustic analysis was flawed. The sounds on the recording didn't actually correspond to the time of the assassination. The conspiracy theories are numerous, and some are more credible than others. The CIA theory points to the agency's hostility toward Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs fiasco and his reported desire to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces. Oswald's murky intelligence connections, his defection, his contacts with CIA-linked anti-Castro Cubans in New Orleans, the agency's admitted failure to share information about him with the FBI, provide circumstantial fuel. The Mafia theory notes that organized crime figures, particularly Carlos Marcello, Santos Traficante, and Jimmy Hoffa, had both motive and means. Robert Kennedy's aggressive prosecution of the mob had made powerful enemies. Jack Ruby's connections to organized crime are well documented. The House Select Committee concluded in 1979 that there was probable involvement of organized crime figures, though it couldn't identify specific individuals. The Soviet or Cuban theory remains the least supported. Despite Oswald's Soviet ties and his visit to the Cuban and Soviet embassies in Mexico City 7 weeks before the assassination, a trip that remains poorly documented and surrounded by conflicting accounts, no credible evidence has emerged linking either government to the shooting. Some theories are more fringe. The Secret Service accidentally fired the fatal shot. Vice President Johnson orchestrated it. Rogue elements of the military-industrial complex acted to prevent Kennedy from withdrawing from Vietnam. Each has its advocates. None have been proven. Here's what the physical evidence supports. Shots were fired from the 6th-floor window of the Texas School Book Depository. 3 shell casings were found there. Oswald's rifle was found there. His fingerprints were on the boxes used to construct the sniper's perch. He fled the building immediately after the shooting. He killed Officer Tippit during his escape. When arrested, he carried a revolver and a forged ID. What the evidence doesn't clearly establish is whether Oswald acted entirely alone or whether he was directed, assisted, or manipulated by others. The Warren Commission's conclusion of a lone gunman is consistent with the physical evidence. But consistent with is not the same as proven, and the Commission's own investigation was hampered by the CIA's withholding of information about its operations involving Oswald. Millions of pages of documents have been released over the decades. The final batch, ordered released by President Biden in 2023, contained no smoking gun, but did reveal the depth of intelligence community interest in Oswald before the assassination, adding weight to questions about what the CIA knew and when. John F. Kennedy was killed by rifle fire in Dealey Plaza on November 22, 1963. Lee Harvey Oswald almost certainly pulled the trigger. Beyond that, consensus dissolves. The assassination didn't just kill a president. It fractured something in American civic life. The basic trust that the government was being honest with its people. Every subsequent scandal, Watergate, Iran-Contra, Iraq WMDs, has been filtered through the lens of November 22, 1963. The JFK assassination didn't create American distrust of institutions, but it lit the fuse. Maybe Oswald really did act alone, a disturbed, grandiose young man who saw an opportunity and took it. Maybe the truth is that simple, and the refusal to accept it says more about us than about the evidence. Or maybe there are things we still don't know. What's your read? Lone gunman or something more? Drop your take in the comments. On the night of August 15, 1977, a radio telescope in Delaware, Ohio, picked up a signal from deep space that was so powerful, so precise, and so unlike anything natural that the astronomer reviewing the data 3 days later circled it in red ink and wrote a single word in the margin, "Wow." That signal lasted 72 seconds. It has never been detected again. It matched every criterion scientists had established for what an extraterrestrial transmission should look like. And in nearly 50 years since, no one has been able to definitively explain where it came from. This is the wow signal, and it might be the closest humanity has ever come to hearing from someone else. The signal was detected by the Big Ear radio telescope at Ohio State University's Perkins Observatory. Big Ear was not a dish like most people picture when they think of radio telescopes. It was a flat, football field-sized array, an aluminum ground plane flanked by two reflectors that looked more like a drive-in movie screen than a piece of cutting-edge science. It had been operating since 1963, and, by 1973, had been repurposed for SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. The telescope worked by scanning the sky as the Earth rotated. It couldn't point at a specific object. Instead, it watched a narrow strip of sky drift past, like a camera on a tripod filming whatever moves across the frame. Any signal from a fixed point in space would appear for exactly 72 seconds, the time it took for that point to cross the telescope's beam width. This detail becomes critical. The man who found it was Jerry Eman, a volunteer astronomer working on the SETI project. On August 18, 1977, Eman was reviewing printouts of data recorded 3 days earlier. The data was displayed as a grid of alphanumeric characters. Numbers 1 through 9 represented increasing signal intensity, and letters A through Z continued the scale for stronger signals. Most of the printout was 1s and 2s, background noise. Then Eman hit a column that read 6 EQUJ5. The U represented a signal intensity roughly 30 times louder than the background noise. Nothing like it had appeared before. Nothing like it has appeared since. The WOW signal had several remarkable properties. It was narrowband, concentrated on a single frequency, at approximately 1420.4556 MHz. This is extraordinarily close to 1420.405 MHz, the emission frequency of neutral hydrogen, the most abundant element in the universe. This frequency matters because in 1959, physicists Giuseppe Cocconi and Philip Morrison published a landmark paper arguing that if extraterrestrial civilizations wanted to communicate across interstellar distances, they would likely transmit near the hydrogen line. It's a frequency that any technologically advanced species would know because hydrogen is universal. It's also a relatively quiet part of the radio spectrum, less interference from natural sources. The hydrogen line is, in essence, the most logical channel for interstellar communication. The signal also rose and fell in intensity in a pattern perfectly consistent with a point source in the sky passing through the telescope's beam. Exactly what you'd expect from a fixed source in deep space, as opposed to a terrestrial or orbital source that would behave differently. And it was strong. Extraordinarily strong. If it originated from the direction the telescope was pointing, near the constellation Sagittarius, toward a region of sky with no remarkable stars, then whatever transmitted it was either very powerful or very close by astronomical standards, or both. The WOW signal met every criterion that SETI researchers had outlined for what an artificial extraterrestrial signal should look like. Narrowband, near the hydrogen line, consistent with a point source. No known natural phenomenon produces a signal with these combined characteristics. But science requires repeatability, and this is where the WOW signal falls short. Despite more than 100 subsequent observations of the same patch of sky by Big Ear and by other, more sensitive radio telescopes, the signal has never been detected again. Not once. If it was a deliberate transmission from an extraterrestrial civilization, why only once? If it was a beacon, you'd expect it to repeat. If it was a directed message, the odds of catching a single transmission aimed at a specific target during a 72-second window are astronomically small. The silence that followed is almost as mysterious as the signal itself. Eman and other researchers immediately tried to determine where the signal came from. The Big Ear had two feed horns, essentially two beams scanning the sky side by side, separated by about 2 minutes. The signal appeared in only one horn. This meant either the source had turned on and off within that 2-minute window, or there was something about the signal's position that fell into only one beam's sensitivity range. The location was narrowed to 2 possible regions in the sky, near the constellation Sagittarius, west of the globular cluster M55. Neither region contains any remarkable stars, planets, or other objects that would obviously produce such a signal. Eamon himself was cautious throughout his life. In interviews, he consistently said he didn't think the signal was extraterrestrial, not because the evidence pointed elsewhere, but because he couldn't confirm it. "I don't think it's ET," he said in a 2010 interview, "but I also can't explain it." Eamon passed away in 2022, still uncertain about what he'd found. The first and most obvious question, could it have been terrestrial? A satellite, a military transmission, a microwave oven at the observatory? The 42020 MHz hydrogen line is a protected frequency. It's internationally reserved for radio astronomy, and transmitting on it is illegal. While accidental interference is always possible, the signal's behavior, rising and falling exactly as a celestial source should, argues strongly against a terrestrial origin. Could it have been a known astronomical phenomenon? Pulsars produce regular radio signals, but they're broadband, not narrowband. Quasars are powerful, but also broadband. Masers, natural microwave amplifiers in space, can produce narrowband signals near the hydrogen line, but known masers in that region of sky don't match the signal's characteristics. Interstellar scintillation, the twinkling of radio sources caused by irregularities in the interstellar medium, could theoretically amplify a weak signal into a brief, strong burst. This is plausible, but has never been demonstrated to produce the specific characteristics of the WOW signal. In 2017, astronomer Antonio Paris published a paper proposing that the WOW signal was caused by hydrogen gas in the coma of a comet, specifically either Comet 266P Christensen or Comet P 2008Y2 Gibbs. Both comets were in the approximate region of sky at the time, though neither was discovered until decades later. Paris argued that hydrogen emission from the cometary coma could produce a narrowband signal near 1420 MHz. He conducted observations of Comet 266P in 2017 and reported detecting a signal consistent with his hypothesis. The astronomy community was largely skeptical. Critics pointed out that comets have been observed extensively at radio wavelengths and have never produced signals remotely resembling the WOW signal in intensity. The signal strength observed by Big Ear would require a hydrogen emission millions of times more powerful than any comet has ever been observed to produce. Furthermore, the comet positions at the time were approximate. The orbital calculations going back to 1977 carry significant uncertainty. Several independent researchers concluded that neither comet was actually within the telescope's beam at the time of the detection. The comet hypothesis has not been accepted by the broader scientific community, though Paris maintains his position. Here is the honest scientific summary of the WOW signal as it stands today. It was a real signal. It was not instrument error. It was not a known type of radio interference. It behaved exactly as an extraterrestrial point source should. It was at the most logical frequency for interstellar communication, and it was never repeated. No natural explanation has been confirmed. No artificial explanation has been confirmed. The signal occupies a genuinely unique position in the history of science, a single, anomalous data point that fits perfectly into a theoretical framework, but cannot be verified because it happened once and only once. Modern SETI has far more sophisticated equipment than the Big Ear, which was demolished in 1998 to make way for a golf course, a fact that still stings in the astronomy community. The Allen Telescope Array, the Green Bank Telescope, and projects like Breakthrough Listen monitor millions of frequencies simultaneously across wide swaths of sky. If the WOW signal repeated today, we'd catch it. We'd locate it precisely. We'd know within hours what it was. But it hasn't repeated, and maybe it never will. The WOW signal is not proof of extraterrestrial intelligence. It's important to be clear about that. What it is, though, is the single best candidate for an artificial extraterrestrial signal ever detected. And that's not a fringe opinion. That's the assessment of mainstream SETI researchers. It appeared once, for 72 seconds, at precisely the frequency we'd expect an intelligent species to use, from a direction in space with no obvious natural source. It hasn't been explained by any known natural phenomenon. It hasn't been replicated despite decades of trying. The universe is roughly 13.8 billion years old. It contains an estimated 2 trillion galaxies. In our galaxy alone, there are more planets than stars. The question isn't really whether something is out there. The question is whether we'd recognize the signal if we heard it, and whether we already have. If someone out there transmitted a single message in our direction, and we caught exactly 72 seconds of it on a summer night in Ohio in 1977, what do you think they were trying to say? Let us know in the comments.